Telling the world Beautiful Lamb of God, give us and pure as snow, gentle and merciful, beautiful Lamb of God, sing from the Father's love, sing from the throne above, sent to redeem us with His love. Beautiful Lamb of God, give us and pure as snow, gentle and merciful, beautiful Lamb of God. Behold the Lamb of God, suffering great pain for us, and by His wounds we all are healed. Beautiful Lamb of God, give us and pure as snow, gentle and merciful, beautiful Lamb of God. Like sheep we've gone astray, He turned to His own way, but Jesus will take our sins away. Beautiful Lamb of God, give us and pure as snow, gentle and merciful, beautiful Lamb of God. What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leading on the everlasting arms. What a blessedness, what a peace is mine, leaning on the everlasting arms. Lean Jesus, safe and secure from all alarms. Lean Jesus, leaning on the everlasting arms. Oh, how sweet to walk in this pilgrim way, leaning on the everlasting arms. Oh, how bright the path grows from day to day, leaning on the everlasting arms. Lean Jesus, safe and secure from all alarms. Lean Jesus, leaning on the everlasting arms. What have I to dread? What have I to fear? Leaning on the everlasting arms. I have blessed peace with my Lord so near, leaning on the everlasting arms. Lean Jesus, safe and secure from all alarms. Lean Jesus, leaning on the everlasting arms. My stubborn will at last hath yielded. I would be thine and thine alone. And this the prayer my lips are bringing, for within me thy will be done. Sweet Jesus gave his life a ransom yonder on Calvary, on Mount Calvary, cruel Calvary, paved the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown. Praise his holy name. Salvation has been brought down. Praise the Lord. Salvation has been brought down. Go and shout and tell the world around. Today, tell it today. Preach the word of God that we might win a crown. Tell the lost salvation is full and free. Spread the news all over the land and sea. Tell it afar, tell it afar. Praise the Lord, salvation has been brought down. All alone without a friend, he sought to pay it all. Yes, he paid it all. Jesus paid it all. In his blessed promises, sweet victory can be found. Praise his holy name. Salvation has been brought down. Praise the Lord. Salvation has been brought down. Go and shout and tell it to the world around. Tell it today. Tell it today. Preach the word of God that we might win a crown. Tell the lost salvation is full and free. Spread the news all over the land and sea. Tell it afar, tell it afar. Praise the Lord, salvation has been brought down. There's a blessed home prepared way over in glory land, in bright glory land, blessed glory land. I have trusted in his love and now I'm heaven bound. Praise his holy name. Salvation has been brought down. Praise the Lord, salvation has been brought down. Go and shout and tell it to the world around. Tell it today. Tell it today. Preach the word of God that we might win a crown. Tell the lost salvation is full and free. Spread the news all over the land and sea. Tell it afar, tell it afar. Praise the Lord, salvation has been brought down. Before the throne of God above.
Okay. Test, test, test. Okay, I think we're on. Yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. So we're in Zephaniah 3. We just barely started chapter 3 last week, but really didn't get far enough to make any difference. I'd kind of wanted to finish the book tonight before the gospel meeting, but as I kind of was preparing, I don't think that's going to happen. So we'll get a little ways into it and then finish it probably the week after the gospel meeting is over. So just to kind of recap briefly, chapter 2. Chapter 2, he does a long time. Well, he starts the chapter, the first 3 verses. Well, let me back up to chapter 1. Chapter 1 is a long discussion of the day of the Lord and how the day of the Lord is going to be a very negative event. God's going to bring wrath and destruction upon the people for their sins. As you go into chapter 2, he starts the first 3 verses with a kind of an introduction to the idea of a remnant that will survive the destruction and will be faithful to God, and God will restore them in the future. And then he spends the rest of the chapter talking about judgments against different nations, and he picks out several nations that kind of are in each direction from Judah. So he does the Philistines and which are to the west, Cush, which is to the south, Ammon and Moab to the east, and Assyria to the north. And he issues judgments against all those countries. And so as God's people are listening to this, they're in favor of this, obviously. It's kind of like what Amos did, where he speaks about these other countries and how God's going to punish them, and that sounds great to the people of God until you realize, oh, he's going to do the same thing to us. And so chapter 2 is about the other nations. So now we get into chapter 3. And what has happened is God's people should have seen what was happening to the other countries and repented based on what they were seeing happening to the other countries. So, for instance, the last country that we encounter in chapter 2 is Assyria, and we know that Assyria falls in 612 BC. And God's people Jerusalem did not fall to 586 BC. And so God's people had a window of time where they could have repented and turned back to God if they had heeded this message and had noticed what was happening to these other countries and how God was punishing them. But they didn't pay any attention to that, and so God ended up punishing them as well. So chapter 2 is about these oracles against these other countries, and now chapter 3, God's going to turn his attention away from those countries and direct his attention towards them. So the first part of the chapter is going to be a negative oracle against God's own people. Now the thing is it starts off and you're not really sure who he's talking about. It doesn't really become clear until verse 4 that he is talking about Judah, but he doesn't actually say Judah or Jerusalem until you get to verse 14. But you kind of start to pick up on the fact around verse 4 that, he's actually talking about his own people now. So kind of with that background, we'll kind of hop into it. Okay, so verse 1 of chapter 3, it starts off with woe. And so when you see the word woe, it means there's a negative oracle that's about to take place. There's actually two different oracles in this chapter, the one that starts in verse 1 and then a second one that's going to start in verse 14. We're not going to get to verse 14 tonight, so we'll just be focused on this first one for tonight. Okay, so he says, woe to her who is rebellious and polluted, to her who is rebellious and polluted, to the oppressing city. So what is he saying in the first verse? Well, the people he's talking to, one, they're rebellious. Okay, so he's labeling this group of people as a group of rebels. So what does it mean to be rebellious or to be a rebel? It means you are violating the law of someone, whoever has established a law. You are breaking that law in rebellion against that individual. And so these people are breaking God's law in rebellion to him. And then it says not only are they rebellious, but they're polluted. And the ESV says defiled instead of polluted. And the idea is whenever you commit a sin that pollutes you or defiles your soul, okay? And the way sin works is once you sin, you become defiled. And then the more you sin, the more defiled you become. But the problem with becoming defiled is it doesn't become satisfied with just defiling you, okay? The way sin operates is it will defile you for a while, but it will eventually lash out and cause you to oppress other people, okay? So one of my teachers often says, when you think about good and evil, there's a big fallacy of the argument, you can have your opinion and I can have my opinion and we can just agree to disagree. If one person is right and the other person is wrong, the person who is right might actually hold to that, whereas if they're good and they're right, they may be content to not lash out against the other person. But evil is never content to not lash out against the good. Evil will always strike out against good, okay? And you see that around the world all the time. Evil always is never content. It always pushes forward. and tries to overtake the good. Okay? And so what is happening here in Jerusalem, the people have become polluted, they are sinning, and they are not satisfied with just staying in their sin, but their sin then has to spread out and attack the other people in the city, which are the poor people, okay? And that's what he means in the next line when he says, they're the oppressing city. So the major sin that Zephaniah is referring to here is the leaders of the city, the wealthy people, the religious leaders, the royal family, and so forth. They are making their wealth off of oppressing the poor, okay? And that is the exact thing that the law says not to do. You're supposed to take care of the poor in your society, and they are violating that. And this is the same thing we've seen in a lot of prophets over and over and over again, where the people in power remain in power by oppressing those that are less fortunate. And we see that all the time in our country today as well. Okay, so this is something that happens in societies over and over again, but it's happening in Judah, which God had told them not to do. Okay, so as a result of that, God is angry and he is going to punish them for it. Okay, so as you move into verse 2, if you look at verse 2, you're going to notice 4 negatives. Every line has a negative. Depending on your translation, it may say no or it may say not. Either way, it's a negative. So it says she. Now, she is obviously referring to a city, but you don't know what city he's talking about just yet, but it's Jerusalem. It says she has not obeyed his voice. So if you don't listen to somebody, why is it that you don't listen? Well, it goes back to the issue of pride, and we talked about this last week. You don't listen because you're too prideful or you're too arrogant. You think that the person has nothing of value to tell you. You're not held liable to what they have to say or whatever the case may be. So you just disregard what they say. But the problem is they're not disobeying another human's voice. They're disobeying the voice of God. And they're basically saying, we don't really care what you have to say. We're going to do what we want to do. Okay. As you go to the next line, it says, she has not received correction. If you look in Proverbs, multiple times in Proverbs, the author of Proverbs says a person who does not receive correction is called a fool. Okay. So God is... You could make the argument here, God and Zephaniah are calling them fools for their behavior, okay? So the people do not listen to God. They are not receiving his correction. What correction is he even talking about here? He just gave them all these examples of these countries around them that have all just fallen for the exact same sins that they're committing. They didn't pay any attention to it. So the fact that they did not change their ways based on the examples of all the countries around them that just suffered the same fate means they're foolish, okay? Now, I know I pick on our country a lot, and I probably should back up and say, I'm proud to be American. I'm not bashing on America because I dislike America. I'm fearful for the future of our country is really what I'm saying. And so as you look at our country, why are we not learning lessons from history? Or why are we not learning lessons that are similar to countries like ours but have already made the same mistakes 20 years ahead of us? And we're just going down the same road of all the European countries that are 20 to 40 years out in front of us, and we don't seem to learn any lessons from any of that. And so that's the exact same thing that Judah is doing here. They're not learning the lessons from the people around them that went through the exact same thing just 20 years before. And so he's basically calling them a fool for not listening to what is happening, okay? And then it says, she has not trusted in the Lord. So to trust in something means that you have a peace because you place your confidence in someone or something. And so in this case, where their trust should be is in God. So throughout the Bible, in the Old Testament, it says phrases such as this, that if you trust in God, you will receive the following things: deliverance from enemies, answered prayer, straight paths for life, joy and gladness, inner peace, and absence of fear. So if you trust in God, you would receive those things. Where do they have their trust at this time? Their trust is in their military. Their trust is in their wealth. Their trust is in their foreign allegiances. And their trust is in their false gods. For most of America, where is our trust? Those exact same things. For most Americans, their trust is in our military, the wealth of our nation, the location of our nation, being that we're on a different continent than most other countries, our foreign alliances, and just to be blunt, most people put their faith in themselves. They don't have their faith in God, and as a result, they're going to fall flat on their face, okay? So this is a major problem in Judah. It is a major problem in our country and in our society. We need to make sure we don't let it become a problem for each of us individually, okay? It becomes a very easy trap to fall into the idea of trusting in yourself, trusting in your own money, trusting in your own skill or ability. All of that is given to you by God as a gift, and it can all be taken away in the blink of an eye. Our trust needs to be in God and God only. And if you do that, you'll receive the things that God promised that I read a minute ago. If you don't do that, you're going to end up just like these individuals here. Okay, the last line, it says, she has not drawn near to her God. The irony of this statement is what isn't clear yet, although I've already told you. What city are we talking about? Well, we're talking about Jerusalem. Where did God supposedly dwell? He dwelled in the temple in Jerusalem. And so what Zephaniah is saying is this people hasn't drawn near to God. Well, how could they not draw near to God? God is literally right there in the center of the city with them, allegedly, so they thought. And the problem is they put so much trust in the temple that they thought God would never let the city be destroyed and never let the temple be destroyed. So part of their problem is they see all these other countries around them falling, and even they saw Israel fall, but they thought, well, it will never happen to us because God will not allow his city and his temple to be destroyed. Regardless of how bad we are, he will never let the temple and the city be destroyed. But in Ezekiel demonstrates a picture of God's glory leaving the city. And so that is what happened. God allowed the city to be destroyed. But they had this false hope or this false idea in the temple being their saving grace, regardless of how bad they got. But the irony is even though God is dwelling in the temple and the temple is right there, and they go by the temple every day, they walk by the temple, they go in the temple to worship, it says they have not drawn near to their God. In what way have they not drawn near to their God? They're right there with him. Their heart's not there. That's the problem, okay? That's the problem with all this. The problem with all this is their pride. They have put all their trust in the wrong places. Their trust is not in God, and their heart is not in God. Okay, their heart is in themselves, and so that is the major sin problem that they have. The heart is misdirected, and their sin is pride and arrogance. Okay, so these are the four big issues, or four issues that Zephaniah is hitting on here. And again, it's all these things are manifesting itself in the terms of oppression of the poor, as well as false worship and all these other things. Okay, so verse 3, he's going to hit now on two different groups of people that are leading the people astray. The first is going to be the civic officials, okay? So it says, her princes in her midst are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves that leave not a bone till morning. So in other words, the civic leaders of the city and the country are not doing what they're supposed to do. So what is a civic leader supposed to do, even in our society? They're supposed to execute justice, right? So for the lawyers here, you know about justice and know how that's supposed to be executed for a nation. And in this case, the civic leaders are supposed to be the ones ensuring that justice is followed. So what is justice? Justice is taking your set of rules and making sure it's applied equally to everyone. In particular, making sure that the poor are protected and not mistreated in the process, okay? And so what they're doing is they are confounding all the rules, or they're bending them in the direction of the wealthy so the wealthy can get wealthier and the poor become more oppressed in the process, okay? So in verse 3, this is a judgment against the civic leaders for not maintaining justice in society, okay? Verses 4 and 5, we're now going to go to a different group of people. Sorry, verse 5. It says, her prophets are insolent, treacherous people. So the first group here is the prophets, the next is going to be the priests. But anyway, he's harping now on the religious leaders of the country. So when it says the prophets are insolent and treacherous, the word treacherous means you can't be trusted. Insolent, or the ESV uses fickle, which that doesn't really help. What it means is, what is a prophet supposed to do? Well, a prophet, if they're a true prophet, they are supposed to tell the people what God says. So they're both basically a mouthpiece for God, and tell the people this is what God says, okay? The problem is if a prophet becomes arrogant, what they can do is ignore what God has to say and then just say whatever they want, but say it's from God, all right? So in the Old Testament, another one of my teachers said this, there's three types of prophets in the Old Testament. There's true prophets of God, and these are prophets that receive prophecy from Yahweh and deliver that prophecy to the people. There are false prophets of Yahweh, which are prophets who say they're from Yahweh, but they deliver false messages that aren't really from Yahweh. Okay, so they deceive the people, say that they're a true prophet of God, when in reality they are not. And then the third category are false prophets from other countries or other religions that don't worship Yahweh. So in this case, you're having to ask yourself, well, what kind of prophet is this? Is this a true prophet of Yahweh or a false prophet of Yahweh? This is a false prophet of Yahweh. So this is a prophet that says they're a prophet and says, this is what God has told me to tell you, but God never told them to say that. Okay, so they're just making up lies, basically, right? So what does God think of someone like this? Well, if a person is willing to stand up and say, this is what God told me to tell you, and it's nothing more than lies, what does that say about their opinion of God? It means they have a low opinion of God, right? That they can stand up and say lies and say it's from God when in reality it isn't, all right? So this is someone who, one, can't be trusted, and two, they have a very low opinion of God. And so God is going to punish this type of individual severely. Now, do we have these kind of people in our society today? Absolutely. How many, quote, churches have, quote, ministers who stand up and say stuff that you cannot find anywhere in the Bible? It's the same concept, all right? So the first line are about false prophets. The next line are about the priest. So it says, her priests have polluted the sanctuary. They have done violence to the law. So he picks out two different things that the priests are doing wrong. So the priests are responsible for two major tasks in the Old Testament. One is they're supposed to teach the Torah or the law to the people. And what he's saying is you're failing to actually teach God's word to the people. Either they're teaching the wrong thing, or they're not teaching at all, or whatever the case. Whatever they're doing, they're not actually teaching God's word to the people. They're corrupting it in some way or another. The second is that they're supposed to be responsible for the sacrifices. So if someone had a particular sin or needed to offer a sacrifice for some reason, the priest was supposed to tell them, well, this is what you need to offer for that particular thing, and help them in the process of offering it. But if they're a greedy priest, they can lie to the people and say, you should offer X when in reality you should have offered Y. And that would allow them to profit off of it because they would get to keep the meat and so forth. So if they had them offer something more than what was necessary, they could basically pocket that difference if they wanted to. And so in both of these cases, the priests are being dishonest with the people. They're not preaching and teaching the law correctly, nor are they helping them do these sacrifices correctly. Okay, so in both of these cases, the priests are not doing their job. So he's hit on two categories. He's hit on the civic leaders and the religious leaders. The civic leaders are not executing justice in society the way they should, while the religious leaders are not executing the religious order, laws, or so forth with the people, which is why, verse 2, their heart is not with God, okay? They have not drawn near to God. The people don't know how to draw near to God because the religious leaders are leading them astray, okay? All right, so with that in mind, verse 5, it says, so verse 5 is now going to compare God to these two groups of people. So you had civic leaders not doing their job, religious leaders not doing their job. Verse 5, we're now going to see what God does. So verse 5, the Lord is righteous in her midst. So God is in the midst of the city, but the difference in God and these two groups of leaders is God is actually righteous. So again, what does it mean to be righteous? Righteous means that you obey the laws that you're given. So in terms of a human to God relationship, God says, I expect you to do this, this, and this. And you do those things, but you do it with a right heart and a right intent. Okay, so you're not righteous if you just keep it, but you keep it in a disgruntled sort of way. I can keep a lot of rules and not be happy about it. That doesn't really make me righteous. So a righteous human is one who keeps God's commands in a loving sort of way. On the flip side, God by definition is righteous. God is the one who gives us the law and the rules. He gives it to us for our benefit. He gives it to us to help us become righteous and be more like him and understand his mind. But he by definition is righteous. So what he's comparing here is God is righteous, but your civic leaders and your religious leaders, they're not righteous. Okay. And then it goes on to say, he will do no unrighteousness, so he's incapable of being unrighteous. And then it says, every morning he brings his justice to light. So the religious leaders were the ones who should have been righteous, okay? They should be righteous, and they should teach the people how to be righteous. They're not righteous. So it says, God is righteous, your religious leaders aren't. Then it says, God is just, while your civic leaders are not just, okay? But not only is God just, he is just every morning. And then it says he never fails. So he is just all the time, okay? He always rules correctly in any situation. He will always show mercy to those who deserve mercy. He will always not give mercy to those who do not deserve mercy. And so your civic leaders are not just, God is just. Your religious leaders are not righteous, but God is righteous, okay? And then it says, but the unjust knows no shame. So God is righteous and just, but your civic leaders, not only are they unjust, they're not even ashamed of it. They're proud of it. They're proud of the fact that they are bending the rules, oppressing the poor to help make themselves more wealthy, okay? Again, this stuff doesn't change much over time. It's the same stuff in our culture today. Okay. Verse 6 says, I have cut off nations, their fortresses are devastated. And what he's talking about, that word means the key parts of a city wall. He can destroy the wall so that, the wall falls. It says, I have made their streets desolate with none passing by. Their cities are destroyed. There is no one, no inhabitant. So what he's saying is, hey, wake up. I did this to these other countries back in chapter 2. You should have seen this happening. It should have been a clue to you to wake up. But you didn't wake up. And why did you not wake up? It's because you're a fool. And so now in verse 7 he said, I said, and so 7 and 8, if you notice, God is actually speaking in the first person in these two verses. So this is God speaking. Actually 6 through 8 is all first person. So it says, I said, surely you will fear me, you will receive my instruction. So in other words, God is saying, now God knows the future, but he's kind of sarcastically saying, gee, I thought you guys would clue in to the fact that I'm destroying all these other countries around you, and maybe you would be next, but I guess you just didn't figure it out. And so he says, surely you will fear me. And so the fear of God, what it should be, is not a shaking in your boots type of fear. It's a reverence and an adoration for God and for who God is. So if you are righteous and you are just, then you will fear God in a healthy sort of way, meaning you will have reverence for God, you will appreciate who God is, and so forth. But if you want to be a fool, you can fear God the other side of the coin, which is you will learn to fear him. And you will eventually bow your knee to him and be subject to destruction. And it's up to us to make the choice. You can fear him one of two ways, and it's totally our choice to make which way we want to fear him. But you're going to fear him one way or the other. And so he says, surely you would fear me, you will receive my instruction, but they didn't. So it says, so that her dwelling would not be cut off, despite everything for which I punished her. So he's saying, I did these things to try to wake you up. I destroyed Assyria, I destroyed the Philistines, I destroyed Ammon and Moab, I destroyed Cush. All this with the intention of waking you up. And you didn't wake up. And so he says, what did you do instead of waking up? Look at the last line of verse 7. Instead of waking up, it says, but they rose early and corrupted all their deeds. In other words, what it's saying is, instead of waking up, repenting, and turning back to me when I gave you ample opportunity and presented all these examples for you to see, instead of returning to me, you did the exact opposite, and you ran as fast as you could to keep doing the sins that you were doing. In other words, you couldn't have made a worse mistake, okay? You just chose in your arrogance and your pride to keep on doing the exact same sins that you were doing. All right, so verse 8. Verse 8, he is going to change course now, and he is going to talk to the remnant now in verse 8. Okay, so In chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, we saw a hint of a remnant that was going to come, but we haven't seen them since chapter 2, verse 3. They've kind of been on the back burner and off to the side, and you might have kind of forgot about them for a minute, but now God's going to talk to that remnant again, okay? So it says, "Therefore, wait for me, says the Lord, until the day I rise up for plunder. My determination is to gather the nations to my assembly of kingdoms, to pour on them my indignation, all my fierce anger. All the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy." Now you may read that and you think initially, how is that a remnant? It sounds like he's destroying something. Well, most of the verse is about destruction, but he's talking to the remnant. So what is he saying? He's saying to the remnant, hold on, I'm in control. This is what I have to do. I'm going to have to destroy these countries, and I'm going to have to destroy Judah. But once this is all done, I'm going to gather the remnant together, and you will be allowed to serve me and be the remnant people that I promised you that you would be. Now, why does God have to destroy Judah for this to happen? Well, think about everything he's been saying. How well can a nation follow God when the vast majority of the nation is corrupt? And the people in power are corrupt. And the people in power oppress the actual people who want to try to be faithful to God. You can't really have it that way, okay? So if your civic leaders and your religious leaders are all corrupt, how can the minority that actually wants to be faithful to God successfully worship God and lead the country back to God? They can't. So what God is saying is, I'm going to do all this destruction on your behalf, so that basically I'm going to clear the slate, and then the remnant will be unimpeded to be able to worship me and follow me. So if you look at this verse and you look back at verse 1, what do we do in a situation like our country where the civic leaders are corrupt, much of the religious leaders are corrupt? How do you get a country like that back to worshiping God? Well, there's a couple of ways. You can clear the deck. I don't know if we want to pray for that or not, because none of us might be around once the deck gets cleared. We might be in another country somewhere, or dead. The other thing is, it's a one person at a time battle for people's souls till you get the majority back. That's our option. So are we actually going to work towards that, or are we just going to sit back and complain until we dwindle down to a couple people? If you want your country back, you're going to have to work really, really, really hard and get serious about it, and maybe even turn your TV off. If you're not willing to do that, we can just keep watching it falling apart. That's basically our options. And a lot of prayer and hoping God will show us mercy. But we're basically in the same spot that Nineveh was in and Judah's in, okay? And I'm not trying to be overly dramatic or negative Nancy or any of those things. It's just reality. All right, well anyway, verse 8 is a little more positive, and actually the rest of the chapter is positive, so we'll try to kind of move in a more positive direction now. We're not going to get very far into the rest of this because I know the bells are going to start ringing here in a second. But anyway, the rest of verse 8 is basically about the destruction. But the other important thing to see in verse 8 is, where will the remnant come from? Is it just from Judah? And the answer is no. It's even the Gentile countries, okay? And so Zephaniah, or God through Zephaniah, is telling them there's going to be a remnant. I'm going to have to clear a lot of fools off the deck before this can take place. But the remnant is going to involve faithful people from Judah as well as faithful Gentiles, okay? And so this is a fascinating and interesting promise that Zephaniah, or God through Zephaniah, is making, okay? All right, so verse 9, it says, for then I will, so verses 9 and 10 are a message to the nations, okay? And then starting in verse 11, he'll start speaking directly to Judah. So verse 9, it says, for then I will restore to the peoples a pure language, that they all may call on the name of the Lord to serve him with one accord. Well, who are these people he's talking about that are going to call on the name of the Lord? From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshipers, the daughters of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offering. Okay, so your translation may say Ethiopia, it may say Cush. It depends on what you're looking at. It's the same place, either way. This is the same country that he issued an oracle against in chapter 2, okay? It was a one-verse oracle. I think it was like around verse 8, maybe. I'm not even seeing it at the moment. Anyway, it's in chapter 2 somewhere. Oh, there it is. No. Well, I'm not even seeing it. Let me check the ESV. Oh, there it is, verse 12. Verse 12 of chapter 2, it mentions it. Okay, so anyway, he's talking to the foreign countries, but he says Cush or Ethiopia specifically. Okay, so if you look at verse 9, it says, for then I will restore to the peoples a pure language. What does he mean by that? Well, what he's talking about, well, first of all, I'll just tell you up front. Some people interpret this as, oh, the Jews got dispersed to these other countries, and so he's only talking to the Jews that were trapped in these foreign countries. If you want to interpret it that way, then he's not actually talking to Gentiles. He's just talking to dispersed Jews that will eventually come back. But most people take it that he's actually talking to the Gentiles in these countries that will be faithful to God in the future. And so what he's saying is, when he's going to restore a pure language, what he's talking about is, at this time, they're actually worshiping idols. So their language is not pure. Their worship language, or you might say the words of their mouth, that they're issuing for a god is not pure. It's them worshiping a false god. But what he's saying is in the future, there will be a remnant from these countries who will actually learn how to worship God, Yahweh, instead of this fake god they're worshiping. And so that's likely what he's referring to. So then on the next line of verse 9, it says, they may all call on the name of the Lord, which is a way of saying that they will worship God. Now, that phrase means something different in the New Testament, but here in the Old Testament, it's talking about, worshiping God and giving God the praise he's due. It says to serve him with one accord. And then verse 10, it says, from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshipers, the daughters of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offering. So in these two verses, he seems to be talking to Gentile nations who at some point in the future will be part of a remnant that worships Yahweh. But beginning in verse 11, he's now going to start talking to the Jews, or the remnant from Judah. And he says, in that day, verse 11, in that day you shall not be shamed for any of your deeds in which you transgress against me. So what is he talking about here? Well, when he's talking about shame, in the current situation, it's hard for the remnant to actually worship God because there's so many people who are not right with God in their country. And as a result, they feel a sense of shame and guilt for the nation as a whole, okay? And he's saying, once I wipe the deck clean of these people, you're not going to be held back by feeling shame for your nation. You will be able to worship me without feeling this guilt or shame. It's not that they feel personal guilt necessarily, but they feel kind of a guilt or shame. So in the Old Testament, a lot of times when it talks about things like this, the people had more of a collective mindset. If one person sinned, it reflected a sin for the whole group, not just an individual. In America, we only think of ourselves as individuals. So if you sin, you bring shame upon yourself, but you don't bring shame. Sometimes people say, well, you brought shame upon your family or whatever. And even that's sort of not as strongly felt as it used to be. People don't feel as worried about bringing shame to their family. But most people don't feel any sense of bringing shame on their country as a whole. But in the Old Testament, that they had a different mindset. So if you sinned, you would bring shame not only on your family but on the nation as a whole. And so what he's saying is God's going to eliminate these people that are bringing shame upon the nation, and so you can take that weight of shame off of you, and then therefore you'll be able to more better. I almost said more better. You can better worship God as a result of that. All right, so it says, the third line of verse 11, for then I will take away from your midst those who rejoice in your pride, and you shall no longer be haughty in my holy mountain. In other words, I'm going to get rid of all these people who have a pride problem, who are arrogant, who are leading the people astray, who are not righteous, who are not just. I'm going to get rid of all them, and we will just be left with the remnant people. And I'll just quickly do 12, and then I know that was the last bill. So it says, I will leave in your midst a meek and humble people, and they shall trust in the name of the Lord. In other words, the remnant will stay. The rest of them are going to be gone. Okay? And I'll stop there. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts? Okay, good to see everybody. Gospel meeting starts Sunday, Ephesians. See you then. Okay. Good to see everybody.